All right, everybody, I think we'll get things underway. Hello, it's terrific to be here with all of you. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Thank you for joining us for this webinar on reducing substance use stigma, the role of first responders. Nous sommes ravis que vous ayez choisi d'être parmi nous aujourd'hui. My name is Catherine Clark, and I'm really very honored to be here with you today as your moderator. On behalf of the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, I'd also like to thank Public Safety Canada for providing the funding for today's event. Nous sommes très reconnaissants de leur soutien à cette importante conversation. And I'd also like to take a moment to offer a land acknowledgement. While we may be gathered today in a virtual setting, we do have people who are joining us from right across Canada. I'm here in Ottawa, so I'd like to acknowledge that I am on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, but I encourage all of you, no matter where you may be today, to take a brief moment to reflect on the land that you are on today as well. So let's talk about the purpose of our webinar today. It's our hope that the discussion will help to increase awareness around substance use and also the stigma that goes with it in the first responder community. Our panelists are going to share some insights on substance use and its relationship to mental health. But we'll also talk about how stigma is a barrier for people seeking and accessing care. And we'll talk not only about its impact on law enforcement personnel, but also on their families and on the communities that they serve. Maintenant, avant de commencer notre discussion, allow me to go over a few quick housekeeping items that'll help us keep this show on the road this afternoon. First of all, please note that all lines will be muted during the webinar. That's just to ensure sound quality. And also videos have been turned off, and we ask that you keep them turned off during the webinar. But even if we're muting you and we can't see you, I want to promise you that you do remain an integral part of this conversation. We're going to do everything we can to take your questions at the end of the session. And we ask that you please submit those questions via the Zoom Q&A function. I think everyone is pretty much a Zoom expert right now in 2021. But just in case you're looking for where that is, the Q&A function is located at the bottom of your screen. And you can literally just input your question there, and we will do our very best to get to as many questions as possible at the end once our expert guests have shared their thoughts and opinions on the question at hand today. Now, in the pre-event, we showed the Mentimeter tool, and we're going to be using the Mentimeter tool for this webinar. But just in case you missed how to access it during the pre-event, it is being shared in the chat box right now. So you can use the tool through the app or on your browser. You just need to go to www.menti.com. You can do that on your phone, on a tablet, in your browser. You need to enter the code 83517875, and then you're part of the conversation. So please do have the Mentimeter tool ready. It's an important way for us to gauge where you're at on these issues, and we'll be using it to obtain some real-time feedback from all of you through the session as well. We have a few polls planned. And well, of course, I was saying it is 2021, feels like one long continuation from 2020, where we've all transitioned to what feels like a mostly virtual world. Of course, that does not mean, though, that we don't have tech hiccups. So if you do experience any kind of technical difficulties, please let tech support know, again, via the chat box. It's located in your control strip on Zoom. And when you send a note there, we'll try to help you out. Finally, we understand that some of the items discussed today may be difficult. If at any time you would like to speak with someone who can offer some support, please know that support services contact information is also being posted in the chat box. Please don't hesitate to use it. That is why it's there. And I would like to ask everyone to be really careful about the language we use today, but also to be forgiving. I'm 100% confident that no one will be intentionally stigmatizing or using stigmatizing language during these discussions, but we are all learning together, and we want to ensure that this is a safe space. So let's go to Mentimeter. We're going to get everyone familiar with how it works. Again, Mentimeter is our polling tool. For today, we're going to launch our first question. And that question is, How familiar are you with stigma related to substance use? So we'll take a couple of seconds to see what you have to say on this, and some interesting results. Majority of you are saying somewhat familiar, and a good group of you are also saying very familiar. These are great numbers. That's terrific. I'm really pleased to see that the unfamiliar bar is relatively low. And for those who are feeling unfamiliar, that's what this is about today. We're going to try to ensure that this is a real learning experience for everyone involved. Okay, so now we're going to get back to, we'll take that off the screen. And as we do that, we are all familiar with how Mentimeter works. Well done, bravo everyone. And we're gonna be using that again during our conversation today. What we're going to do now though, is we're gonna move from our first poll to our first video. And I'm really pleased to introduce the Honorable Bill Blair.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this webinar from my office, which is located on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. As you all know, communities across Canada are in the grips of a serious drug epidemic. The opioid crisis has been a sad reality in our country for many years, but the COVID pandemic has made things much worse, with many communities reporting record numbers of deaths, emergency calls, and hospitalizations. The Government of Canada is tackling this crisis on several fronts. We're taking action to reduce the supply of illicit drugs in Canada, to stop the illegal importation of toxic substances, precursor chemicals, and opioids like fentanyl that are being mixed in with, and in some cases contaminating, other drugs. We also recognize that substance use is a serious health and social issue at its heart. It's estimated that 1 in 5 Canadians, 15 years of age and older, will experience a substance use disorder within their lifetime. And yet, despite this prevalence, far too often our society looks down on problematic substance use. It has been treated as a moral failing or something for the criminal justice system to deal with. And this stigma has had serious consequences. It has prevented people from reaching out for help and getting the treatment that they need. And in that sense, it runs counter to our internationally recognized national strategy for substance use. The pillars of that strategy are enforcement, prevention, treatment, and harm reduction. There's a major need to address stigma in our society at large, but it's also important to raise awareness of it in the law enforcement community in particular. As first responders, you are often the first on the scene when someone has overdosed or when there's a crisis situation involving substance use. As a former police officer myself, I know that these situations can be hard to witness and to deal with. I also know that we must treat people with compassion, dignity, and understanding. And that's why this webinar is so important. Given the crisis that we're in, it's also very timely. The webinar is specifically targeted to members of the law enforcement community. It will help you better understand and help those suffering from substance use disorders. Topics that will be explored include substance use and its relationship to mental health, stigma as a barrier for people who are seeking and accessing care, and stigma's impact not only on the people who use substances, but upon their families and their communities. The Government of Canada is committed to the health and safety of all Canadians. We support the use of harm reduction approaches by law enforcement and all first responders, and this includes efforts to reduce substance use stigma. And that's precisely why we provided funding in 2018 to launch a public education campaign to address stigma that creates barriers for those seeking treatment and other services. And through that funding, Public Safety Canada partnered last year with the Canadian Police Knowledge Network and the CCSA to develop a drug stigma awareness training module specifically for law enforcement members. That online module complements today's webinar. It's being offered free of charge to Canadian law enforcement personnel right through 2022. I would encourage all law enforcement personnel to complete this training, and I'd like to thank the CCSA for offering this webinar. I want to take this opportunity as well to thank you all for taking part today and for all that you do every day to protect Canadians and to save lives. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much to Minister Blair for contributing to our conversation today and to the national dialogue on this issue. And now I hope you'll join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Porath, the Director of Research at the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction. As an internationally recognized subject matter expert, Dr. Porath's expertise is sought out by the Government of Canada. It's also sought out by the World Health Organization. She's a member of the College of Problems on Drug Dependence and the International Council on Alcohol, Drugs, and Traffic Safety, and is co-chair of CCSA's Expert Advisory Group on Cannabis. Dr. Porath, welcome. We're really glad to have you here today to offer some introductory remarks. Thank you very much for being a part of this conversation.
Great. Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Catherine. And I'd like to thank Minister Blair as well for his remarks. We're so proud to have Public Safety Canada as a partner for this webinar today. CCSA is an established national voice in the field of substance use and addiction. We use the latest scientific evidence to reduce the harms associated with substance use in Canada. And one of those harms is stigma, discrimination, prejudice. Attitudes have shifted, and we've come a long way with so many things. Increasingly, we're talking about barriers and trying to see the harm that's often hidden, but still very much felt. Stigma is one of those barriers. The word refers to negative attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors that devalue a person. You can feel this way about a stranger, a colleague, or a loved one. And sometimes you can feel this way about yourself. The World Health Organization did a study across 14 countries, and they found that substance use disorder was the most stigmatized condition. Research shows that stigma is a major barrier for people who are trying to get the treatment they need. So if we want to help people, we have to dismantle this barrier. With more awareness of substance use disorder as a health condition, we can begin to shift our thinking. And part of that involves the language that we use. After all, we don't say someone who has an eating disorder is a food abuser. In Canada, 1 in 10 people suffer from some kind of problematic substance use, and this adds up to tens of thousands of people. It doesn't discriminate. It affects people from all walks of life, even first responders. As direct service workers, you're often the first to respond to crisis situations with people who are experiencing substance-related harms, just as the minister said. So you're going to see it firsthand in your work life. You may be experiencing it in your personal life as well, either with a friend or a family member, or even with yourself. And if you are, then you know how much stigma can hurt. Understanding more about problematic substance use can change our attitude and approach, whether on the job or at home. And even small changes can help to make a world of difference when someone is suffering and needs help. And that's why we're here today. I'd like to thank the speakers for sharing their knowledge with us today. And I'd also like to thank Catherine Clark for moderating our discussion and for helping us stay on track. And finally, I'd like to thank you all, the participants, for taking the time today out of your busy schedules to be a part of this really important discussion. And I ask that you please take what you learn here and share it with others in your workplace and in your home. Words matter. The language we use makes a difference. So let's get started and find out how. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Porath, for those thoughtful comments. And thank you for setting the stage for the conversation that we are going to be having today. I'm really looking forward to introducing our panel guests, but I do just want to reiterate, what you said. For a lot of the people who are in the audience today, for a lot of the panel guests, for all of us, we ourselves are either directly affected by these issues personally, as you mentioned, or in the workplace. We all know somebody who may be or may have been, and this is really a journey as we look to how we can create an environment in which everyone feels safe and accepted, and of course, destigmatized. So building on what you just said, let me introduce our panelists for today's conversation. I hope you will all join me in welcoming Dr. Kim Hellemans, professor at Carleton University, Gord Garner, Executive Director of the Community Addictions Peer Support Association, also known as CAPSA, Sergeant Joe Brownrigg with the Ottawa Police Service, and Superintendent Isobel Granger, also with the Ottawa Police Service. We are so pleased to have all four of you here today. Thank you very much for taking the time. So Dr. Hellemans, let's start with you. We know that there are many people who use substances, and there are many who don't, and there are some who use less frequently or more frequently. There's very much a spectrum of use. And with this in mind, it would be, I think, a good way for us to start with a fundamental baseline question about why some people develop a substance use disorder and others don't.
Thank you, Catherine, and bonjour, welcome, kwekwe to everybody. And don't worry, I'm not going to teach you neuroscience. This is not going to be above everybody's head or brain. But I think it's important to recognize that we don't really have a recipe of what actually causes a substance use disorder. If we did, we'd know we'd be much further along. We know that there are a number of variables that absolutely contribute to the development of substance use disorders. And I think it's also important to mention what doesn't cause or what isn't at the root of a substance use disorder. And as Minister Blair was saying, it's not due to weakness or lack of willpower, right? We hear this a lot, even in 2021, when we are not following the moral model of addiction. We hear often from colleagues, family members, friends who might say, well, if you just wanted it badly enough, right? And this is really speaking to the lack of awareness as to how the brain is changed with a chronic substance use disorder. The other thing that we know is that addictions aren't caused by the drug, right? Drugs don't cause addiction. If that were the case as well, we would see that any individual using a drug or substances would develop an addiction, and this is absolutely not the case. So what I say is that addictions are caused by three main factors. Number one, the addictive substance. For sure, there are substances that are more addictive than others. I would also argue there are behaviors that can become addictive, such as eating, or even sexual behaviors can develop into compulsive behaviors. The second thing is vulnerable individuals, and I'm going to touch on that in a moment. And then the third factor is stress. So let's talk about that vulnerable individual, right? So what are the things that when we have that interface of an addictive substance and a vulnerable individual and stress that lead to a substance use disorder? One is absolutely genetics, right? We know that there's no gene for addiction. You can't inherit a gene that leads to addiction, but there are certainly small variations in the genes that we inherit from our parents that do contribute potentially to vulnerability. But again, it's a clustering of these genes, and it's less of a one-to-one relationship. The other are things like personality and mental health disorders. These pre-existing things can certainly render individuals vulnerable to addiction. And then finally, trauma. And this is something that I'm sure our participants and panelists are very much aware of, this impact of trauma. We know very well that experience of trauma can predispose to addiction. And it's not just about abuse, right? We tend to think, somebody has to have experienced sexual abuse or severe incidences of trauma. And it can be even things like poverty, neglect, experiencing oppression due to the color of our skin or our gender or sexuality. Having these experiences throughout one's lifetime can certainly render the brain quite vulnerable to addiction. But I also want to pause and say that having trauma also isn't the one factor that predisposes. Several individuals may have experienced trauma and not developed a substance use disorder. So it's not to say, I didn't, right? So it can't be about the trauma. So in my remaining few minutes, I just want to talk about the brain, right? So despite the fact that every substance, alcohol, heroin, nicotine, they all work on very different parts of the brain to yield their effects, they all merge on common pathways in the brain. And that's really at the root of why we see addictions develop. Number one, they act on the reward pathway. So the part of our brain that is lit up whenever we encounter very pleasurable or rewarding stimuli, such as food or even a sexual mate. Drugs do impinge on this system. There's also the part of the brain that's involved in fear and stress, that is also impacted by substances that are addictive. And finally, the circuits of our brain that involve the very anterior portion of our brain, our prefrontal cortex, which sends signals back to those lower brain regions. We often talk about the lizard brain and the monkey brain, right? The prefrontal cortex is kind of like our executive control. And it's involved in decision making and attention and kind of controlling our impulses. Now, what we know is that no matter the substance, all drugs impact these systems. And we think that those pre-existing factors that I discussed earlier, existence of experience with trauma, personality, mental health disorders, genetics, they all alter those pathways to varying degrees so that when an individual encounters substances, it has a very different qualitative and quantitative effect than somebody who may not be vulnerable. So people who use substances, they may end up with more problematic use.
You know, Dr. Hellemans, the things that you're mentioning are so intuitive to us now, and sometimes you look back on how far we've come in a fairly short amount of time. We still have a long ways to go, but it's pretty remarkable if you think back a decade or two in terms of how we talked about these issues to where we are now. One of the things I'd like to talk to you about, because of course the audience today that we're speaking to are first responders who are going into situations every single day which are incredibly stressful. Can you talk to us a little bit more? You mentioned stress, but can you talk to us about stress and its relationship to substance use, and also in terms of coping and stigma?
For sure. And yeah, stress is a huge piece of it. That's what I started my PhD thesis, looking at stress and its impact on vulnerability to addiction, because we know it does, as you mentioned, it's very powerfully involved in substance use disorders and addiction. So I can say that stress it's involved in the initiation of substance use disorders, it's involved in the maintenance, and it's involved in the relapse, right? Imagine that you're scared, or you're in a situation where it's very, very fearful. Right? The first thing that the brain is going to do is pump the body full of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. And the next thing that's going to flood all through our body to try to cope with that stressor. The other thing that's going to happen is there's key circuits in the brain that are activated to try to also engage in various coping strategies, right? So imagine, and this is particularly the case if it's prolonged, right? So imagine feeling overwhelmed at work, which many of us are feeling right now, or experiencing marital strife. These experiences affect our body and our thoughts. We literally feel uncomfortable, and then we might initiate a coping strategy to get through that. And for some, that coping strategy is drug use, right? Or behaviors like food or compulsive sex are very good at reducing these feelings of discomfort and anxiety or stress. For some, it's exercise or calling a friend, right? So there's lots of different coping strategies, but for sure, stress and coping with substance use is quite common. And the brain is very good at learning that association, right? We are hardwired to learn how to reduce negative feelings, right? We're hardwired to approach things that aid in our survival. We're hardwired to also avoid things that are threatening our survival. So when we learn a coping strategy, the brain's like sticky little glue. It'll say, that worked for me last time, I'm going to do that again. And then, as I mentioned, when drugs are on board, they target that reward pathway. And then also to try to combat this flood of these, the brain's pleasure hormones, it will actually act on that stress system to try to pull it down, right? So while the drugs are on board, rush of dopamine, opioids, the stress pathways are going to say, whoa, too much, and try to pull it back down. And what that means is that when the drugs are metabolized and they're no longer in the body, the stress systems are still high. So in withdrawal, we also experience feelings of stress and anxiety, which can promote further use, right? And so finally, and this is also why it's really important that folks that are in chronic substance use disorders, chronic users, are offered drugs to often assist with that detox, because it can feel awful. It can literally feel like people are dying, and they need those substances in order to counteract these feelings in the brain of sudden removal of the drug. And so finally, like I said, it's initiation, maintenance, and relapse. And if somebody has been attempting a period of sobriety, it's really hard not to rely on those tried and true coping strategies if you experience stressors. And let's look at where we are right now. We're in a global pandemic. Things have been highly stressful. We're physically removed from our loved ones and our support groups. And these are times where having that period of stress and not having the alternative coping strategies can really render an individual much more vulnerable to a relapse. So, and how does this relate to stigma, right? You asked me, how does it, what's the involvement of stress and stigma? People feel shame and blame when they return to drug use as a means of coping. And I do want to quote my president of Carleton University, Benoit Antoine Bacon, who's living in recovery, who said, we as people who are not experiencing a substance use disorder, we think drugs are the problem. But for individuals who are in that space, drugs are the solution. So wouldn't it be wonderful if we treated the brain like every other organ in the body? When something went wrong with that, when something changed the way we behaved and how we acted and how we emoted and how we coped, wouldn't it be wonderful if we treated it like all other chronic diseases and gave people supports and lots of opportunities and care and wellness, as opposed to that shame and blame?
Yeah, and Dr. Hellemans, I just think that's such a great way to end this first portion of our discussion in your first comments, because that's really the essential element too, isn't it? This idea that on one hand, this is about science. On the other hand, it's also about empathy. And that's really what we're trying to also showcase today as well. So thanks very much. It's a great way to get our conversation underway. And I'd like to turn next to Gord Garner. Hello, Gord. It's great to see you.
Hi, Catherine. Wonderful to be in your company again and with this conversation in front of us.
Well, and Gord, when we use the word stigma, and we've used it a bunch of times already today, we're describing attitudes, or maybe beliefs, maybe behaviors that discriminate against people. But we know that there are also many other layers to stigma. And frankly, Gord, I think it's wonderful that we have the chance to hear from you today, because you've encountered some of those personally. Can you describe what those layers look like?
Yes, and so if you step back far enough from this and think about all our healthcare systems, our policies and our laws, were drawn from a false belief about people who use substances. And then imagine what that looks like. So it's all about blame. It's all about if you're ready, you will. If you suffer enough, you'll stop. And so the whole system got set up on that basis. And it got set up on that basis with the intention to help. And so that really makes it complex, because you go back and say, by the way, your intention to help doesn't work. Maybe, but that we'll just put more of it. We didn't help enough. So more help would be more consequences. And so that sort of rabbit wheel continues. And so you look at structural stuff. And I think the key point in there, Catherine, you talked about beliefs. And so we like to use the term false beliefs. It's all based on false beliefs, because if the beliefs weren't false, it wouldn't be stigma. And there wouldn't be anything we could do about it. It would be just people being right and then mistreating others because they're right. So what are the false beliefs? Well, the false belief is it's a choice. The false belief is that suffering is a pathway to wellness. And then you just extrapolate from there. The other false belief around there is who has this issue. So if I said to you, I won't quote the newspaper, there's an article the other day about 20,000 Canadians had lost their lives to the opioid overdose since 2016. And you say, oh, they're addressing this publicly and ending the stigma. But then you step back and say, but they didn't mention the other 280,000 deaths. Because 300,000 Canadians have died since 2016 from substances. But they didn't pass from the right ones. So it doesn't matter about those deaths. You won't find any headlines. You scan the last years, you won't find any headlines about the 60,000 Canadians that die from substance. That's systemic population-based stigma, because the majority of those people are passing away from substances that we think they should know better than. Because we still think as a society, if you know better than, then you shouldn't. That's making sense to you, Catherine?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and
so
go ahead, Gord.
Well, and even that's, we learn from our experiences, And so we need to recognize that most Canadians use substances for their benefit. That's why there's pharmacies every 6 blocks. That's why there's an LCBO. That's why you can buy cannabis, because most people enjoy using substances and it's beneficial. I really want to move this conversation towards substance use health. And so we stopped talking about substances as bad things and talk about health as a good thing in regards to substance. Just as we talked to mental health. No one suggests that you don't have you don't have a mind anymore. You know, it's health that's really the issue. And that's going to be the next level of door opening around that.
Well, what you've just been saying, Gord, is a good way to segue into another poll that we're going to do, because when we're talking about stigma, again, like we've talked about already today, a lot of it is the words that we use, the reactions that we have. So we're going to go to a poll right now. And the question is, what words or phrases have you used or heard someone else use to describe a person who's using substances or is thought to be using substances? And some of those, it's coming up as a word cloud. And there sure are a lot of them.
Yeah.
We definitely use some pretty damaging words, don't we?
I don't see any that I haven't used on myself. And so this really is, as you pointed out before, Catherine, this compassionate piece, that we don't know until we know. And so how can we bring this information that these words are more than name calling? They're harmful. They block and inform resources. They stop people from asking for help. And so sometimes, you know, people are interested in the word prosecution, but I'm interested in the word persecution, because prosecution might be the tip of the iceberg. We prosecute some people around substance use and possessions of substances, but we persecute this huge iceberg underneath the water of people who can't talk about their substance use health.
I remember one conversation with you, Gord, that I found really eye-opening was you talked about the fact that so many people who are dealing with substance use issues are doing so behind closed doors, that we think of addiction as something, we immediately paint this picture for ourselves of it's someone living on the streets. But in fact, in homes and apartments across this country, there are people who are dealing with it silently and quietly. And, that word cloud, those were tough words, and no one wants to be thought of that way. Even if you know that you're dealing with an issue, you don't want to be thought of as a junkie or a crackhead or any of those other horrible words that we do associate with this issue. So can you talk to us about what words we can use instead? How do we get away from those words? Where do we go? What kind of language can we use?
Well, it's what we've done with other social issues. We start talking about people. And so people that are suffering, people that are using substances, people that are suffering from health issues. But if we don't talk about people, and I'm sure you might remember the wallet story here really quickly. Here's a person, here's substances and behaviors. If I talk about their substances and behaviors, I can't see the person. If they call themselves the same things we just saw, the same things I used to call myself, I can't see myself anymore. And then we only see what has taken place. We can't see what might take place. So as soon as I start talking about the person who's using substances, I can see the possibility of change without the demand. And whether this changes or not, I have empathy towards people. I don't have empathy towards inanimate objects. So language is a very powerful tool. And I'll just say, you're mentioning about these images that you come up with, right? But they're images that we've been taught. Our newspapers, our TV shows, our movies have shown us the images, right? I saw one earlier today. And this immediate image of scattered possessions and scattered paraphernalia. This is what we think we know about. And our brains are hardwired, as Kim was talking about, image to words, right? And so this isn't something you can just decide to change. It's a practice, not just in the language, but where that goes with the image. So I always try to suggest that people, when you think about a person using substances who's having difficulties, think about a child who set off to have the best life they could and has done their very best. And this is the experience they're having. Not because they failed, not because they didn't try, not because they didn't care, not because they don't have any moral fibers. This is the experience they had as a result of things that you don't know about yet. But you're looking at a child who grew up doing their best to have a good life.
Yeah, that's a pretty powerful way to look at it. Okay, thank you, Gord. We're gonna hopefully hear a little bit more from you as the conversation goes on, but we're gonna turn now to Sergeant Joe Brownrigg. Joe, we're really glad to have you here, and thank you for being a part of this conversation.
Yeah, much appreciated. I'm very passionate about this. I have a lot of experience. I've been in my 19th year as a police officer. I worked a lot of really busy areas and saw firsthand the issues that are caused by substance use disorders. And myself, I struggled throughout my life with a substance use disorder. A lot of lived experience. Thankfully, a pretty significant period of recovery that I'm in now. And I'm now sort of at the point where I'm trying to help other people as much as I can. So I appreciate being asked to be here. Thank you.
Well, I can't tell you how grateful that we all are that you're willing to share your experience, both the personal experience, which I imagine really informs the professional experience too. And it's probably a good way to start for you to give us a sense of the challenges that first responders face with respect to stigma and substance use.
Sure. So I'm going to start this, the answer to this question. I've collected a bunch of quotes from police officers. Some I've interviewed myself and some from other sources. I recognize that the audience, there are some first responders that are here listening. Maybe this will resonate with you. It's not with any intent to shock people or upset them. There is some stigmatizing language that's in it, but I just want to frame the conversation and the answer, at least anecdotally. Let's get into the mind of a police officer, okay? So Officer 1, when I was a junior officer, I used to think they were all the same, committing crimes to feed their drug habits. As my career and experience has progressed, I now feel that these people don't need jail, they need rehab. And some of them need to be forced to stay there until they get better. Officer 2, you knew it was them, depending on what area you worked. But if you got a rash of break-and-enters, you knew it was them, and they were trying to get money for dope. The ones that had been doing it for so long, I never saw them as someone you could provide assistance to. They don't want to get better, and they don't care. Officer 3, the health system just doesn't have the ability to handle how big a problem this is. So we end up as the last resort by default. We end up dealing with it all. Officer 4, I've seen so much drug-related death, I've really grown to hate drug dealers. The users are a different story, but I mean, we're never going to win the war on drugs. And Officer 5, yeah, you have no control over it. I mean, the number of times I woke up in the morning with a hangover and I said to myself, I'm never doing this again. I'm never drinking again. I can't do this anymore. And then that same night, you're in a liquor store buying a bottle and you're drinking it. You totally forgot that feeling from the morning. And finally, and this one hammered the point home for me, Officer 6. The turning point for me was my encounter with a sex trade worker who was about to use heroin. I went to take it away and she began crying and pleading with me not to, because she would just have to prostitute herself again to get more heroin. I realized I was not helping her, and it taught me that I was just re-victimizing people. They're just going to do criminal acts again. So to frame my answer, I have it in 2 parts. The first part I'm going to speak to is, how do the challenges related to stigma and substance use disorder affect the communities we serve and our interactions with the community? Traditionally in policing, it's an enforcement approach. We're going to enforce our way out of this problem. We have laws that exist to help us, as Gord mentioned, to force people into recovery. Us versus them. I like Gord's wallet analogy. Where's the person in that? Us versus them. So it's not conducive to helping at all. Internally within policing, there's a lack of conversation on the topic. There's a lack of guidance or training. We're just starting now. We're just starting to have these webinars and start looking into these things. Police are a Band-Aid solution to social disorder problems. Okay, we're out there on the streets and we're going to these calls and we're dealing with things and we're just trying to apply a Band-Aid so we can get to the next call and put a Band-Aid on that one too. And many of these issues require surgery, not Band-Aids. And you got the same officers going to these calls, putting Band-Aids on with the same people, same issues. And then the officers carry that weight. If they're sensitive, empathetic, they start to get sick. At least in my case, that was exactly what happened. Carrying that weight. feeling helpless, feeling hopeless. Really, when it comes to how stigma and substance use disorders affect the communities we serve, every officer has to take a critical look at their behavior, how they're responding to things, and ask if they're bringing people closer to recovery or farther away. Okay. The second part of this question I'd like to answer is organizationally, how does stigma affect within the police department, right? Or any other first responders? How are your departments and the sort of the subculture and the actual culture, structural culture that exists where you work? What if you have a substance use disorder like I did or do, right? So with that lived experience, I can look back now, thankful that I have so much time in recovery, but I remember how I used to feel, and it was a massive distrust towards my organization. And I was very, very hesitant to come forward and speak about any of my issues because I felt I would be categorized as a problem. And I didn't trust my organization or my managers to actually help me. I felt like it would definitely be a barrier to that happening. I remember appreciating some of the efforts of the organization, but feeling they weren't genuine. The police department has to come up with some kind of employee assistance program and say that to everybody, but is it truly genuine, right? And when you don't have that trust that exists from the start, it's just not going to work. And I felt that well into recovery, to be honest. It took a long time for me to come out of that. One of the methods I used that really helped me was informal supports. They were related to my work, but it was other officers, but not tied in with the organization. So there was an importance there. The other thing is that our families are along for this ride too. We need to talk about that. So my wife, my children, everybody is along for the ride. Not only any kind of issues you have, but your policing career as well, and the issues that come with that. So what it all culminates in terms of stigma, and when you ask about the challenges we face as first responders, it's a barrier for those we serve. It's a barrier for them to seek care, and it's a barrier for ourselves to seek care if we are starting to recognize we need to take a knee.
So then, Joe, what do we do about it? I mean, what do you recommend in terms of breaking down those barriers, both in terms of those you serve and in terms of those that you feel are still in place within law enforcement communities?
Yeah, that's a big question. And I don't think I'm going to answer it here. We can start to have the conversation. I can provide some of my sort of anecdotal experiences, things that work for me. One thing that's important is organizations, when they decide that they want to put resources and put money into supports, that makes it okay to not be okay. So I know within Ottawa Police where I work, they created a wellness section. They devoted people to it, and they devoted people to creating programs that will help us. So they created a formal peer support group, and they did an early intervention program. And then through this wellness section, they'll offer supports to us, and they'll collect databases and lists of places that we can send people. What that does organizationally is it tells me as an officer, okay, they recognize that it's a difficult job that I've been asked to do. And it's okay for me to say, I got to take a knee right now. And there's something there for me to help. So that's really critical for the organizations to buy into that and devote to it. I know the other thing that really helped with us in Ottawa Police, they had a partnership with a doctor a few years ago, and they ran a medical program. It was based on our benefits package. It was called The Real You. And it was a comprehensive package available to all the employees of the police, focused on mental health, physical health, nutrition. You'd go through this year-long program. And for me, it was eye-opening. It was incredible. So for the organization to link into that, that's a key thing, right? It's okay to not be okay. We recognize that. We want to help, right? Continual training and workshops. So if we want to have a webinar every once in a while, or we want to talk about this every year on a training day when we got 15 minutes, we got to fill at the end, sure. That's not going to really work. But if you're going to continually hammer home the message and talk about this issue within our organization, we talk about stigmatizing language, we're going to talk about all this kind of stuff, it'll change the game. So for me, there were three things I remember that really had a profound impact. So one was an ethics conference that my organization put on. They brought in notable speakers from the Army, internationally, and talked about what's guiding you in your interactions with the public. And it put an ethical view on things, and it was very profound, very profound. And I remember coming out of there being changed by it. So that, those kind of things should be happening regularly. There's a doctor in the United States, a clinical psychologist named Dr. Kevin Gilmartin. He's sort of an expert in law enforcement psychology and what we go through in this job. Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement is the book that he wrote. And I brought my wife. RCMP had him a couple of years ago here in Ottawa, and I brought my wife, and we both went, and it was eye-opening as well. So spending a day in a room with talking about why it's okay to not be okay when you're a police officer or a first responder. The other thing is, a lot of what this conference is about is the drug stigma for awareness for law enforcement course. So I did that just recently. Gord had me do it, and it was long overdue. Phenomenal training program. Guys and girls, it does not take long. Just get on there and do it, but pay attention to it because the content in there is very eye-opening. Organizations need to recognize and appreciate informal support groups, like I mentioned in my earlier answer. And I think the key in all this is continuing non-confrontational discussion in our hallways. That's going to fix everything. We're going to keep talking about it, and we're not going to accuse, we're not going to blame, shame. It's okay to not be okay, which leads to the whole stigmatizing language piece. That is critical. I know Gord hammered that point home, and that's a big part of the training program as well. And that's it, Catherine.
You know, Joe, I think you touched on this a little bit, but kudos to you too, because you talked about listening to other people speak publicly about it, but that's what you're doing. And so when you're willing to share your story and your personal experience as well, that gives someone else permission to raise their voice or put up their hand and say, I need help too. Because one of the issues that I imagine first responders face is that the rest of us look to you to be the strong people in a situation, right? We're often turning to you on the worst days of our lives or when we're really down and out. And there's an expectation that you're all going to be the strong people. And that's a heavy burden to bear. And so I really appreciate, Joe, that you're willing to be one of those people who steps up and steps out and says, help is there. And when you need it, you need to call for it. So thank you very much.
Thanks for that. I appreciate it. Thank you.
So we're going to talk with our final panelist now, and that is Inspector Isobel Granger. Isobel, welcome. It's really good to have you as a part of this conversation.
I'm really glad to be here. Never thought I'd be on this side of the conversation because, like Joe and many other first responders, I was on the other side responding to. And so it's kind of an eye-opener to not only be on the side of the conversation, but to not really to, I wouldn't say straddle the fence, but to see both sides of this really complex and nuanced, I don't know even what to call it, and yet to try to exist and navigate through.
Well, Joe and Gord have both given the impact of stigma on the individual. But another thing that that certainly Joe mentioned was that the individual is rarely the only one affected. Can you expand on that a little bit for us, Isobel, when we talk about stigma around substance use, how that also impacts a person's family and the entire community around them?
I think what struck me just so far with this webinar was, when I saw a lot of what's been said, but I saw the words on the cloud because I had heard those words said about lots of other people, but I'd never thought that one day I'd have my beloved son, who I know is one of the most gentlest, most talented human beings I know, being called all those names and more. As a police officer, I've been a police officer for 31 years. And even as a constable responding to calls for service, some of those calls involved transporting people with substance abuse to detox and to the hospital or mental health facility. But I always, because of the way we were raised, I always tried to look past the surface because my parents used to stress upon us not to judge people unless we had walked a mile in their shoes. And so I'd always try to look past what was on the surface of that person I was dealing with and try to engage the human being behind that struggle, And I'm glad that I was raised that way because I think that was part of the resilience towards dealing with this thing with my son. And I think one of the most difficult things for me was, looking at the daily stats, because at the table I sit at every morning, we talk about statistics and what happened the day before. And when you look at all the people that have died as a result of substance use disorders and the impact on families, for us, for my daughters and I, this became the center of gravity for us. Everything we do, we are, and for the longest time, just centered around my son's substance abuse issues, and all the labels, the embarrassment, the shame, and watching him being treated with so much disrespect that was actually difficult to navigate through. I remember standing in the courtroom and remember taking, some of the disparaging looks that were cast upon myself. And then when they ask me, what job do I do? And I tell them that I'm a superintendent, in a police service. And all of a sudden, it's different respect for me. I'm thinking, no, I wish you had looked at me the way you're looking at me now when I first walked in. Because added to everything that's gone with the stigma attached to my son's substance disorder issue is the intersectionality of him being a racialized male, and just the stigma that's attached to that. So it's a very nuanced, multifaceted, very complex thing. I always think to myself how people are so fortunate, even when they're judging us, that they don't have to carry what we carry. And I always think, if only they knew how much, no matter how much they judge my son, no matter how many names they call him, it couldn't actually top the amount of names he's called himself and how much he's judged himself. And to us, he's the brother, the son that we've loved, funny, talented musician who had such a promising future and who has still such potential. And to others, he looks like a lost cause. Or every time he makes a promise to stop, that it's just another con. To us, every promise he makes is an opportunity for him, and we try to believe that. And as a police officer, I used to think that my life would be so structured, my kids would be structured and perfect. And but nowadays, when I look at it, this is no respecter of persons. Anyone can fall prey to this. My son started with a broken leg and ended up from painkillers to where he is now. And I just try to look out for others, what they're going through. I'm so grateful for people like Joe and for Gord. And for that, we do have a wellness section at the OPS that actually I was able to reach out for, and they connected me with services. And so, nowadays when I hear the judgments made of my son, and I just forgive. My shoulders are not big enough to hold all that stuff. And I just hope that they never, ever have to go through what we've been through as a family.
How is your son now, Isobel?
He's been sober now for 2 months, but he's in a structured environment. But unfortunately, as I think Joe alluded to, and as did Gord earlier on, is that the system still pretty much applies a criminal justice solution to a substance disorder issue. So we're not at the point where we actually are looking at the cause and trying to treat that, because I liked what Dr. Hellemans said early on, that I understand now that it's not about the drugs, it's about a lot of other things.
So what do we do, Isobel? I guess in some ways we've asked a question of most of our panel guests today, but what do we need to do to reduce that stigma? I mean, you've talked about it, and it's so deeply personal. In some ways, when it's ourselves, when we're talking about ourselves, it's one thing. But when you're talking about your kid, I mean, everything goes into your children. Your whole life is about your children, and to watch them suffer and to watch them be judged. What do you want the rest of us to know? What do you want this audience of your colleagues to know about your experience that may influence how they treat others, they support others, they support their community?
Well, first of all, there go you, but for the grace of God. That could be you, it could be me. And I think we need to do a better job of demystifying and educating on the reasons that people develop substance use disorders, as it's been we've heard earlier on, and to address the biases that are associated. That, as I said, it's no respecter of persons, could happen to anyone. And to I liked Gord's analogy with the wallet there, to personalize by having people like myself and Joe and others, so that other people know that they are not alone. Do you know when I started, when this became such an issue for me, when I stumbled upon a member who had a son in exactly the same, well-respected police leader who had a son in exactly the same situation mine was, it actually took a lot of stress out of what I was going through. And I think that we need to, once we begin to demystify and be more empathetic, I think a lot of our members will even come forward. Because as Joe said, it's a big job that we handle. And I think another thing is personalizing these stories and, humanizing people with substance use disorders. Sometimes it's a really good friend said to me one time that, at the very worst of their substance use disorder was one person that believed in them. To me, that little spark actually helped this person to hold on to hope. And you never know that your one kind word could be the catalyst to a very changed life. And I give a shout out to a number of police officers that have really been kind to my son. And one was a group of police officers in Milton in Southern Ontario that he says, Mom, I was feeling so worthless. And these officers, this particular officer talked to me like I was a human being. He says, I left there feeling like I was coming back, like I was worth something, I was valued. That's what we need.
Yeah, it's really powerful, Isobel. Thank you for sharing that story. And I mean, I'm sure I only say what so many in the audience are thinking, but we're all thinking about your son. We're thinking about you, but we're thinking about your son too.
Thank you.
So let's turn back to our audience now, because we've heard a lot in just the past hour, and it would be interesting to hear how what we've already heard today might change how we may all speak or how we may interact with people in the future, because a lot of what we've heard is putting the personal accent on something that we may be a bit removed from. And so let's put up our next Mentimeter poll question now. That question is, based on what you heard today, what words or phrases do you now plan to use to describe someone struggling with substance use or someone who has a substance use disorder? And we'll show those results now again on the screen. Yeah, see, look at that difference, eh? Isn't that incredible? So we've got human and person and friend and healing. These are really different words than what we had up in the last word cloud when we think about the words that we have used to describe people with a substance use disorder: individual, struggling with change, human being. Yeah, really powerful. Okay, thank you to our audience. Thank you for being so engaged. I really appreciate it. I know our guests do too. But thank you for sharing your thoughts on this in the poll so far. And actually, you've also been submitting a lot of questions too. So I want to get to some of those too. Question 1, hello, regarding stigma, I want to ask you, what are the differences regarding the experience of stigma by people with addictive behaviors, adolescents versus adults, men, women, substance use versus other addictive behaviors like gambling or video games, social networks, shopping, etc. And, let me throw that question to Dr. Helleman, if you don't mind.
Sure, I do know there is evidence to show that there is this gradation of stigma, right? We tend to, even within the drug using community, heroin use is stigmatized more than alcohol use. Injection drug users are stigmatized over and above other forms of use. And then women are stigmatized more than men. And then, as Isobel was alluding to earlier, racialized folks, homeless folks. Right. So it is, the intersectionality is so key here, is that it is very much, you can have layers and layers of stigma on top of having a substance use disorder. And so an acknowledgement of all of these pieces is crucial in our moving out of a place of, stigmatizing beliefs and attitudes. Is like, why do we stigmatize women more than men? Oh, because they're more likely to be mothering, right? Oh, you couldn't take care of your kids. Why don't we say that about men, right? So looking at these layers of roots of stigmatized attitudes and beliefs is really crucial to moving through that.
Yeah, and it would be really interesting, Isobel, can you comment on the fact that when we talk about the gradation of stigma and the different levels of it and layers of it, we talked to Gord a little bit about that earlier. In terms of the added element, female, racialized, how do we deal with those added layers?
I think it's important to get informed, to be informed about what they are, because they are not. A lot of times they're not really visible to look at them. They're very nuanced. I'll share a story with you, and I don't believe my son would have an issue with it because he's given me permission to talk. But just that because he's a black male, and because some of the places that he'd go to because of with substance use disorder, that being looked at as he might be a pimp, and that kept him depressed for days on end, and because to him he's doing all these other things and he knows that he's trying and it's not happening for him, but then for how could you look at me and think something like that? So and then you can imagine, for me, I never thought, I'm a very private person, but my life is an open book for other people. And even as a racialized mother, standing in a courtroom, standing for my son and being looked at, and listening to labels like these people or those people, sometimes words are powerful. Words matter, and sometimes people don't realize that they've labeled somebody. But I think it's important to realize that people from traditionally marginalized backgrounds have the added challenge when they face issues like this, because of who they are and what society's the labels that society puts on them.
So building on that, I'd like to throw this next audience question to Gord, because it does have to do with stigmatizing language. What can we do in the community to address the culture of stigmatizing language if we continue to hear it after the resources and information or education has already been given?
So I think this is where we get into this idea that we don't want to stigmatize people for using stigmatizing language. And so we don't want to shame the shamers. And one of the big reasons for that is most people don't know what they're doing. And so I noticed in the cloud, we still had some folks using crackhead and druggie. And so that's okay, right? We don't need everybody to change their mind and change their opinion. What we're trying to do is take the easy ground forward and find the folks who don't know and are willing to learn, right? And so we're not going to do that by wagging our finger at people. And I went through this experience in my life a couple of times about changing my language around different communities that I didn't know at the time I even had a problem. The world brought the problem to my feet and was kind enough to teach me. And so the question will be is no one will do this because there'll be a moment of discomfort, right? Because it will be a friend. It won't be the stranger you don't know that you're going to intervene with. It will be somebody in your life. And you're going, wow, I know you said this at breakfast last week, but this week is not okay, right? And so, but I said it at breakfast 2 weeks ago. And so this is going to be a surprising conversation. So it's about what I learned. I want to share what I learned. And then you can decide if you want to learn it as well. But I'm not telling you you're wrong. I'm just telling you what I learned. And then that doorway's open and people can walk through it or not. And then what I do with my own friends is we have this thing, we give each other permission will let us know than when we need more practice.
What does that mean, Gord?
That means that I have a stigmatizing attitude and beliefs towards people who use substances that was ingrained in me for over 40 years, right? And that there are times that it will emerge, and I don't even know I got it anymore, right? And one of those things is pretty subtle, because I think that if you didn't use something really powerful, yeah, you shouldn't really have a problem. Don't tell me you messed up on the white wine, right? And stigmatizing attitudes, false beliefs, right, about what suffering looks like and what, real addiction looks like and all that kind of stuff. And so, but the arrangement is with my friends is, hi, if you see me using stigmatizing language or acting on a stigmatizing belief, can you please let me know? Because I can't always see. And so we can step on each other's toes instead of walking on other people's graves.
Yep. That's a good way to look at it, Gord. Joe, there's another question from the audience, and I'd like to ask it of you. I don't know if you're going to be comfortable answering it, but the question is drug decriminalization part of the solution? Are you willing to answer that?
Yeah, no problem. I'll speak to that. In fact, for those who aren't aware, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police put out a report within the last year, and that was their recommendation, that decriminalization for just possession. So they had a whole committee that went on that. And I actually know Chief Mike Sear from Abbotsford Police, and I think he chaired that committee as well. So it's certainly being looked at the high levels of policing within our country, and they are making recommendations on that. So I saw some of the chats before. There was reference to Portugal, et cetera, et cetera. What I can say anecdotally from my experience, there needs to be enforcement for predators, okay? Enforcement will always be part of it, like Bill Blair mentioned. Enforcement's always part of the solution, but it's where is that going to be directed? And I think many first responders, not to speak for them, but I think I can safely say this, as their experience goes on, they recognize that substance use disorders are a health issue, not a criminal issue. And many times the people we're dealing with in the streets, even if they do turn to criminal activity, they're victims. They're victims. So what good are we doing, right, if we're criminalizing that behavior? And I mean, Isobel spoke to some of it too, right? These are our families. Say we're going to put you in jail and then you get sober for a little bit. No. So I hope that answers the question. And I would like to refer the audience to you can just Google it, Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police and the drug policy. You'll be able to give it a good read, and it's quite a good report.
Yeah, thanks for drawing our attention to that, because I think there's been a lot of conversation about that, and what the right course of action is over the years. I mean, not just right now. So thank you for drawing our attention to that. I'd like to bring Dr. Hellemans back into the conversation. We have a question from the audience. Can you describe what concurrent disorders mean?
Sorry, that is a psychiatric term. It's often used when we diagnose individuals with disorders, often psychiatric, can be neurologic. Concurrent means occurring at the same time. So, and there's often cases of concurrent disorders. Things like ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is often concurrent with an anxiety disorder. Substance use disorder is often concurrent with an anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder. So it's talking about the coexistence of more than one diagnosis.
Okay. That's very helpful. Thank you very much. So actually, I might get you to build on this through this next question that we have from the audience. And I encourage any of our panel guests who have something that they'd like to add to Dr. Hellemans' response to add to this too. The question is, what other resources can panelists suggest for first responders who'd like to learn more about these issues and support services?
So I have created a bunch of videos on this topic, some freely available animations on the neuroscience of addiction and stigma that I've worked with CCSA as well as CAPSA in the past, and we're creating another one on opioids and stigma. I'm creating another one on cannabis as well. So those are, if you look up my name and YouTube, I will pop up. I'll allow the other panelists to speak to some other resources because I'm sure they have some in their back pockets, mostly Gord as well, I'm sure is a man of plenty. But I did want to take an opportunity while I have the stage. Gord was talking about education and you know, the constant learning of our language. And I do want to say, I'm a university professor. I'm in a position where we're often considered the experts. And I want to say how often Gord has come to me and revised my language. And even over the last 5 years, and I think Gord and I can't remember how long we've known each other, but his words echo in my brain when I'm giving my lectures on addiction to my students. And so I think it takes a great amount of humility to be able to acknowledge that you don't always have the answers and you aren't always right. And even though I might be a so-called expert, I still have a lot to learn and to gain. And by, I would say, as much as you can, learn from the lived experience community, learn from the folks around you. And we all, you know, as Catherine mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we all have somebody in our lives that is either living well or not living well with a substance use disorder. Learn from the people around you because their experiences are valuable just as much as the statistics and the academic papers. And so I just want to say to Gord, again, his influence on who I am as an academic and as a human has changed immensely. It's changed me as a person. So keep learning, keep being open.
So Gord, I will ask you to respond potentially with some resources too, but just before I ask you to do that, and Joe and Isobel, I'd love to hear from both of you as well if you have resources to suggest to your colleagues and to the audience today. But Gord, building on what Dr. Hellemans was saying, you know, language really is evolving, right? It's you have also taught me some of the words that I should and shouldn't be using. But part of the problem also is feeling uncertain, not wanting to offend, not being sure what is the right word or isn't the right word. When we have those concerns, are we okay to voice that, Gord? Are we okay to say, look, I'm not sure what the right word is. So if you have it, will you tell me? If I use the wrong word, I hope you'll tell me. Is that okay, or are we further stigmatizing when we say that?
I think anytime we're going to, I thought you were going to ask me if Kim made me cry. So all of this stuff is emotionally impactful to me today, Catherine, and you know, Isobel and Joe and yourself, you know, that as a society, we're looking to learn. So that tells me, like, you know, I'm not that great of an orator, and I may be a bit industrious, but I'm not very effective sometimes. But this language in our work and in our partnership with CCSA in particular has really spread this message a long way. And so what that tells me isn't that I'm right, but that other people are seeking change. Other people are interested in having better outcome. And so that we are speaking constantly to our allies who haven't been able to talk about this before. And now that they're able to talk about this, they're finding out how I can talk about this in a non-harmful way, in a supportive way. And of course, who's going to be good at it? Canadians haven't had this conversation to date. So how are we going to be good at it? So, but it's just, hey, can I start somewhere? And can I begin to be adoptive with the language? And is it okay if I make a mistake? And you started that off today, Catherine, right? By the way, this is a panel on stigma where we may do some stigmatizing things, right? That's just true. But we're moving directionally correct. And again, you know, Kim mentioned about our friendship in our meeting and stuff like that. You know, sometimes she forgets to mention that she chose to speak to me, some sort of stranger who walked up with a banner in my hand and said, hey, right? You know, and yourself, right? Same thing. You chose to took the time to come and meet me one day and then gave me a lot of your time that day.
You had a banner that day too, Gord.
It's a simple tactic to have something in your hands so you can show people safety. because if they can see what is in your hands, they feel less threatened by you. Just so you know. And so, but that's the sort of stuff, creating safety for people to have these conversations, right?
Right.
But none of this would happen if people didn't say, yes, I want to learn. There's something wrong going on with our country. 300,000 people did die. And then there's all the harms around that aren't there yet. And yet we can't talk about it.
So the resources, what would you recommend if you could name one or two resources to which people can turn?
Well, I think it's important that we recognize that the Canadian Centre for Substance Use and Addiction is the national organization that's leading the work in many areas. But I also would say to you that CAPS is a national facing organization working on stigma and language, and that our website and resources and our YouTube channel, our social media is filled with material that can help you and filled with videos. And we're going to be, you're probably an email after this. We're releasing our first responder video this afternoon in timing with this webinar and looking at that. And I think it's so beautiful that Joe and Isobel have the courage to be here. The public safety has the courage to host this event, and that we're talking about all of us, not somebody outside the window.
Isobel, you have spoken publicly about your experience, and I would imagine that I'm 100% certain that you may occasionally feel alone in your journey, but you're not. Are there resources that you have used, one or two resources that have made a direct and positive impact on your own life?
Well, I know what one of my first lifelines was when I reached out to our health and wellness, and they connected me to Gord, and Gord connected, was really one of the most positive in this whole journey, was one of the first positive encounters I had, and then of course I do attend a smart recovery once a week. And that's, it's an online virtual event with others that, I attend with families of people that have gone through, and it's one of the wonderful things was realizing that, we are all just people doing life who've had this happen. And it doesn't normalize substance use disorders. It normalizes our humanness, that we are subject to substance use disorders. And I think, for me, I say words are powerful as well. And they either create or they break down. So we have to really work on our words and, but be forgiving too, because, people, people sometimes don't mean to say hurtful things, but they do. But I think there's all kinds of resources there. I know with OPS, they've done a good job as trying to bring this to the surface with a wellness initiative. That's that's been my port in the storm, I think.
Joe, thoughts from you? Particular resources? And if not, don't worry about it. We have a bunch of questions that we can keep going through as well.
Resources, and it's not a fuzzy answer. There's not enough. There's not enough. For those first responders in the audience, that's why the question comes up. Where do we go to learn this stuff? We're only starting this conversation now. And I mean, that's what this webinar is about.
Right.
A good starting point, and I mentioned this in my earlier answer, is if you're on CPKN, the Canadian Police Knowledge Network, a lot of the police services are signed on to that as an online training program.
Right.
Drug stigma awareness for law enforcement. Okay, that's the course that's kind of, we've been talking about throughout the course of this webinar. Just start there. And I would suggest that every single one of us, if anything in this webinar resonated with you, you are becoming a resource yourself, because you're going to take that back to the hallways of your organization. You're going to have conversations when they do come up, and you're going to have maybe a new viewpoint or something resonated with you. So you now become a resource to change the subculture, to change the culture of policing and how we're doing this and how we're helping people. Our chief, he's recently outlined priorities. Our new chief, and duty of care is one of the big ones. So having that lens of everything we do is to humanize people and help people, right? So let's keep pushing forward. I think that's the message I'd like to say.
Well, and one of the comments from an audience member, question as well, but was, this is a national webinar. What are some of the national resources that are available? And it's clear, some of those have been outlined in your answers, but it's clear that this is a problem that is faced by communities big and small, right across this country from coast to coast to coast. And people really are hungry for where they can turn to get the information that they need, either for themselves or for a loved one or a colleague to help them try to make some positive change in their lives. One question, Joe, I'm going to get you to tackle this one. Through my work supporting individuals with mental health challenges and overcoming the anxiety of returning to work following illness, I've come to recognize that self-stigma is often much worse than the stigma from those around us. How can we help people to be a little bit better tuned into perception versus reality? Joe, what do you think?
That's a really tough one. It's the self-esteem issue, right? And it's actually at the core of a lot of why people turn to substances, to self-medicate, for lack of a better term. How can we help people? Geez, we need. I mentioned it in my earlier answer, right? Make sure that those supports are in place from an organizational perspective, right? So that people do have avenues that they can reach out to, that they trust. That's the big one. So. And training, it's all kind of coming back to the same stuff, right? Making sure that the proper mechanisms are there to help support people, but also that people are aware of these things. They're aware of what self-stigma is, right? And how does that tie into everything that you're dealing with? When you get to the core and the root issue of what you're trying to deal with. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's a good stab at it. And Dr. Hellemans, this was an interesting question too. How can we encourage people who are using drugs in a problematic way to seek out treatment when they can't access resources due to barriers such as deteriorating mental health? That's a really interesting question, and be interesting to hear your answer.
How do we try to encourage folks to access services, particularly now?
So how do we encourage people who are using drugs in a problematic way to seek out treatment when they can't necessarily access those resources due to barriers? So they might have, in this case, the person is suggesting a deteriorating mental health condition.
Yeah, that's really, really challenging. And I'd love to hear Gord's response to this, because I'm not a treatment doc, but I do think, it's at the crux of the issue, right? Even like I can speak as well. I'm a university professor. I've got hundreds of students with mental health challenges, and we have a beautiful webpage that lists all these wellness resources, and it's about getting the student to access them and sift through them, right, and navigate them. It is really, really hard, and especially when you're in your lowest points. Depression is marked by loss of motivation, anxiety. You might be so overwhelmed with thoughts you can't even think properly. You're having an inability to pay attention at any given time, and it's really hard to see a loved one go through this. So the way, and I saw there was another question I like asking how EMTs can better provide services to folks that they see that are struggling and need supports. Always try to find be yourself a vessel of knowledge, right? So for my students who are struggling, they come to me, I make sure I'm aware of what the resources are that are available to me. And this is part of community health, right? When we all educate ourselves, then we are better able to help somebody who is unable to help themselves. So I would say, perhaps it is that space for you to seek out what resources can be available to that individual and try to navigate those spaces, which can be really, like, I have a friend whose daughter was suicidal and took 3-4 days to figure out how to get supports for this person. This shouldn't be happening. And it is, right? The systems and the structures in place are overwhelming, even for folks who, right? Imagine folks that are unable for various reasons, right? New Canadians, people with disabilities, severe mental health disorders. So it's incumbent upon us to also create better resources and to make them more accessible for the public. So Gord, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Catherine, we got time for my...
We sure do, Gord. We always have time for your thoughts. Give us your quick thoughts, and then we'll go to one last question before we go to the video you were talking about.
Okay, then I just wanted to let you know that one of the things we can do for other people is be well ourselves, right? And so that we sit as a source of safety for folks, and that we don't bring the expectation that you're going to get better because I care, but I'm healthy because I care. Right? And so then we don't look for the outcome, we look for the being with. Can I be with you when you're not able to get better? And we do that with many other health conditions. We talk about quality of life, we talk about being with people, we go sit with people when we know they're not going to get better, right? And so we just meet someone where they are, and it's safe for them not to be well with us. They can't disappoint us. They can't let us down, you know. And Joe touched on the internalized stigma, right? You know, these folks have let themselves down. We made our own promises. We had our own goals. We all wanted to have good lives. And if I haven't made it yet, who do you think's more disappointed, you or me? And so the last thing I need is someone suffering and with challenges with mental health, to have someone else say, I know you can make it. Well, how would you know that? Because I don't know that yet, because I haven't. And so, but I can be with you and I can care for you, and I can do that when you're not well. And then we'll be curious about what happens. That's all. Right? And then there's at least one healthy person in the equation, and our society is healthier as a result.
Thanks, Gord. I'm going to ask this last question of Isobel and of Joe in our final couple of minutes here. This is a question from an ER healthcare worker who says, oftentimes I struggle with communicating with colleagues who do use stigmatizing language to those with substance use disorders. My question for Joe, but Isobel, I'd really like your opinion on this too, is how do you suggest helping colleagues within the field of law enforcement who have difficulty seeing the importance of using destigmatizing language? It's interesting how often this comes back to language. Joe, I'm going to have you start, and Isobel will finish with you.
Really difficult, because you have to be tender about it. Tender and kid gloves. It's funny, this question comes up because I had a conversation within the last week with one of my peers at work, and it was a bit of a debate. And I think that's how the conversation was framed, where I didn't accuse him or shame him for using that language. You know, Gord spoke about that, right? Very, very tenderly approach it. And there was a disagreement. You know, we have a lot of first responders, people who are very frustrated and they're burnt out, quite frankly. And they're projecting that on the people that they're serving, because if you could only stop using drugs, my problems would go away and your problems would go away. And it's like, there's no patience. The fuse is so short now. So just opening the door to another viewpoint in a tender way. I mean, there's no framework for that, right? It's just how we talk to people, trying to get going in that direction and opening up the conversation. Non-confrontational. I mentioned that in my initial answer. Don't be confrontational about it. Let's just talk about it. Everybody's got an opinion. They're all valid. Let's get there eventually. Thanks,
Joe. Isobel, final quick thoughts from you?
Yeah, I totally agree with Joe. I used to coordinate a leadership course at the Canadian Police College, and one time during I think it was an ethics presentation, ethics module. I put a picture on the board and on the slide, and it was a picture of a young girl standing in an alley, wearing a short skirt and with a jacket over, And I asked them, "What do you see?" And then all the names we saw in the cloud were thrown out by people as to what they saw. And then one of the leaders in the course, she stood up and she said, my daughter struggles with, and she talked, and her daughter was, I think she was addicted to some narcotic. I don't remember what it was. And then she told them a little bit about the struggle. And this is somebody that everybody respected. Then I asked them again, I said, so look again at that picture. What do you see now? And the words just changed. They were so sympathetic, empathetic, and even after the session, they were going to and saying, listen, if there's anything I can do. I think it's the humanization of, because, like I said when I spoke earlier, I see my son, I see the wonderful, helpful, loving young man that I've always known. Just double click on that, just see what's underneath the surface, because it's a humanizing. These are people.
Well, let's see how this conversation has influenced things. We're almost out of time, but I want to really quickly go to our last poll. In 1 or 2 words, what is one action you can take today to reduce stigma in your role as a first responder in the workplace and the community? So that's showing up as a word cloud again. And I think this is such a good way to end this conversation. You can see a lot of positive words in there. Words like listen and empathy and educate and respect. It's nice to see. It's a work in progress. But thank you for taking part in that poll. And I want to thank each and every one of you, our panelists and our audience, for being a part of this conversation today. Thank you very sincerely for sharing your experiences and your thoughts and your questions as well, for being so engaged. I really appreciate it. And I would also like to thank Public Safety Canada and Minister Bill Blair for making this event possible. I'll note that a recording of today's session will be made available shortly, and we'd appreciate it if you could take a moment to complete the session evaluation. It'll be emailed to you shortly. It's being shared in the chat box now. We'll use your feedback to create resources to better support the first responder community. It's clear there's a real need. For additional resources, you can visit ccsa.ca/stigma. And if you haven't already done so, we really encourage you to take the Drug Stigma Awareness for Law Enforcement from the Canadian Police Knowledge Network. And we're going to end today with a new video, which offers a bit more information about just that. It's from CAPSA. Gord mentioned it. That's how we'll end. So I'm going to wish all of you an excellent day. And thank you once again. Merci, mesdames et messieurs, for your involvement. Let's roll that video now.
Hi, it's Gord Garner from the Community Addiction Peer Support Association. I want to have a conversation with you today about peers we have in police services or police service members and their families, suffering in silence, unable to identify what's going on.
My brother had too much of the wrong help and not enough of the right help. It impacted his willingness to seek treatment and then left him alone when he passed. Co-occurring mental health and substance use disorder can present even greater challenges to the person working on their own health and wellness and on our communities on how to help them. When you add in discrimination and all too often criminalization for personal possession, as in my brother's case, the doors close even if pulled on.
The brother whom I grew up with developed an addiction in his youth. He didn't choose addiction. It was fun, then it wasn't, and he couldn't stop. That's when I treated him like I was told by society, harshly for what I saw as his choice, not compassionately for his health condition and his compromised ability to choose. He died, I believe, needlessly because of how our society treated him when he got unwell. We have been confused for years that consequences changes behaviors. The truth of the diagnosis of substance use disorder is most clear. The behavior continues despite the consequences. So our society's insistence of using consequences on people whose mental health diagnosis is based on the lack of a healthy responses to suffering says much about us as a society. In some tragic way, it mirrors the struggle of people with substance use disorder, unable to change their behavior despite negative results.
I'd like to speak to you about some challenges I faced with stigma and managing my substance use disorder. Where I work, we have a unique subculture. and almost by necessity, we're questioned on everything we do, not only externally by courts, media, the public, but internally. And unfortunately, it's truthful for me to say this to you, we're very, very hard on each other. Your competence as a police officer and your ability to solve complex problems are held in high regard. And if you fail to meet that mark in any capacity, it's almost a guarantee you're going to be criticized internally. That's why it was really difficult for me to look myself in the mirror and start to be honest with myself and recognize that I couldn't do it anymore. So I spent a large portion of the beginning of my career self-medicating, substance use disorder. And it took a long time to get to the point where I realized that I needed help and I didn't really know where to go. If I come out and say I'm weak, I need help, it's kind of contrary to the image I'm supposed to be projecting in the uniform, that I can help you, you know? I'll give you an example. So we do have some support groups internally. We have some that are run by our organization, but there are some that are peer-driven, where we look after each other. And one of the groups I used, we go by the name called Badge of Courage, because of the courage it takes in my environment, in my subculture, to expose yourself and just simply to ask for help.
I sit before you as an ex-police officer who once actively sought out those who use drugs. I judge them all as criminals, and I reinforce the stigma, the guilt and shame that comes with drug use. I also sit before you as a person in recovery from alcohol and other drugs, one of the millions from around the world. The irony for me was that the stigma and attitude that I had as a police officer, and many still do, towards those that use substances, kept me from asking for help, as it does so many of us, and that needs to change. There are so many hidden police service members suffering with substance use disorder, often traumatised by the work that they do, often putting the job before their own needs. If those who are serving in law enforcement can't show compassion and understanding with each other, how can that not spill out into the communities that they serve? We must help each other, support those who are struggling with substance use disorder, and help break down the stigma. We are all in this together.
It's not okay. Can't continue this way. It's impacting family, friends, community, impacting the services they provide our community. And most importantly, they're suffering. There's something wrong with that. There's something we need to do about that. Police service members, sworn and unsworn, and their families, they're part of our community and they have the same issues our community has. We need to recognize that the police service community is a community that has its own particular suffering around substance use disorder. We need to start using person-first language, talking about health outcomes, and continuing to nurture ourselves and our community so that everyone can get help when they need it and no one is left behind.